I do understand. Now, from your perspective and consciousness, if we can raise our consciousness, say for an example, history. Yeah, I was looking at Times book, and they had the history of the world actually, and they began history with ancient Egypt, and after ancient Egypt, they had Africa beginning around 300 BC, and they came all the way up to Greece and Rome, and then Europe. But Africa, Egypt is in Africa, so human history begins in Africa, and Africans saw themselves and the world as one and the same. In other words, the air we breathe, the water we drink, the earth we eat from, it's all a symbiotic relationship. And I was thinking that the more the deeper you let that become a part of your consciousness, the more power you have within the universe, if it's collective, to bring about a change, a liberation for ourselves. Because if you're one with the universe, certainly if enough of us got together, it's like the drop of water from the ocean. The drop has every element of the ocean, but you can't grow a well in it. You can't float a boat. But if you get enough drops together, you got the ocean. Now, a lot of people tell me I'm a space cadet, but I still would like to get, because some way we got to get out of this. So I'd like your insight.
Well, certainly your point is well taken. And just as a footnote, as I'm sure you know, and many of your listeners and audience recognize, if you look at the geography of that part of Africa, you may note that the Nile River flows from the heart of Africa northward, which is not the course of many of our major rivers. And that has linked the heart of Africa with Egypt like an umbilical cord historically. And in fact, I'm doing a research project right now that probably won't come to fruition for a few years that talks about the relationship between Egypt and Ethiopia, and more specifically discusses how in the 19th century, after the US Civil War and the defeat of the slave owners in Dixie in 1865, that many of them crossed the Atlantic to Egypt, where they joined the Egyptian military, and in fact, in many cases, led the Egyptian military in an Egyptian attempt to seize Ethiopia. Of course, the conflict between Egypt and Ethiopia stretches back millennia and continues to this very day. One of the sore points in Africa right now is that Ethiopia is building the Grand Renaissance Dam on the Nile River, and the Egyptians, as you know, consider the Nile to be their lifeblood. They feel that this dam threatens their lifeblood. And so there's been serious talk, actually some of it caught surreptitiously on tape, a serious talk in Cairo about destabilizing the regime in Addis Ababa. In fact, this may be subsequently revealed, but I suspect that when in 2021 and 2022, well, mostly 2021, you had this conflict internally in Ethiopia between the Tigrayans and the central government in Addis. I always suspected that the Tigrayans were getting some sort of assistance from Cairo, although I can't vouch for that, the veracity of that supposition. I may be incorrect, in other words. So I agree with you that the study of Egyptian history is important. It's part of introducing people, it seems to me, into this cycle that I made reference to moments ago, whereby you see that over time, history goes through cycles. And just because, excuse my chuckling, but just because it seems today that the North Atlantic countries are the top dogs on planet Earth, only the ignorant and the silly think that that's always been the case and that will always be the case, or only the people who don't want to struggle or who are comfortable with falsification would believe that. And so certainly studying about the glories of Egypt, ancient Egypt, would help to introduce one to the point that history, world history, goes through cycles.
I have written out about, I don't know, pages and pages and pages. And I wanted to come out because I thought that we would have a much better quality of production in person, and which I still do. So I'm looking forward to having a couple more sessions. I was hoping we could do maybe 4, in which we could cover, because I'm asking people to send in questions who see this first tape, to send in questions that they would like for us to ask you, which will help us in actually raising our consciousness and taking a road that will give us more strength, more durability, more spiritual oneness with the universe, and more ability to survive. Because again, I'm like you. It can get worse. And I was just looking at the brother that was shot in the back today, in the back of the head, and this is happening all the time. And I don't, as I said before, I don't really know what's happening. I don't know about all the stuff, the covert and all this. I'm just trying to talk to people and try to get a deeper understanding of what may be going on and how do we get out of it. So I turn to people who I know does a lot of studying, have a fantastic memory, like yourself. I don't know where you get that memory from, but it's powerful, and I thank God for it. Well, I thank the universe for you. So if you can kind of summarize in what I'm trying to put my fingers on for you to guide us in, I would greatly appreciate you laying it out.
Well, to the extent that I'm comprehending the direction you're driving me towards, I would say that with regard to Black people in North America, and to an extent, Black people all over the world, since the rise of what could be referred to as European hegemony post 1492, that the wisest amongst us have tried to internationalize our struggle. That is to say that when the Spanish got a jump on the rest of the world by sponsoring the freebooter Christopher Columbus circa 1492, and then were able to liquidate a goodly number of the indigenous from their perch in Santo Domingo in the 1520s. They had brought enslaved Africans to what is now South Carolina. Of course, it was not South Carolina then because the English did not arrive there for decades. But the Africans revolted, defected to the indigenous side, and chased the Spanish back to Santo Domingo in the Caribbean, which, unbeknownst to them, of course, opens the door to an English invasion decades later by 1607 in Virginia. Then in 1565, the Spanish established a foothold in what is now St. Augustine, Florida. Some of your friends in New York City actually have roots in St. Augustine, Florida, although I'm not sure if they stretch back to 1565. The enslaved Africans brought to St. Augustine, Florida, oftentimes allied with the antagonists of the Spanish, speaking of the French and English, and the indigenous to undermine the Spanish. Then post 1607, with the invasion of what is now called Virginia by the English and the arrival of Africans by 1619 in that part of North America, you saw the Africans begin to turn the tables on the English by allying with the Spanish against the English, just as that previously they had allied with the English against the Spanish. I say all this to say that we, in order to make progress, have had to make alliances, particularly global alliances. That's the import of the Haitian Revolution, for example, which we allied with. That helps to explain the revolt led by Gabriel in Virginia in 1800, the revolt in Barbados circa 1816, the revolt by Denmark Vesey a few years later in what is now Charleston. And of course, to fast forward to the 20th century, one of the reasons why US apartheid, Jim Crow, as it was called, began to retreat in the middle of the 20th century was because African and Caribbean nations, such as Ghana in 1957, Jamaica in 1962, were coming to independence. Washington felt it was handicapped in winning their hearts and minds in the titanic conflict with the then socialist camp led by the Soviet Union. And so Washington felt that the better part of wisdom was to retreat from the more horrible aspects of Jim Crow. And we're still in that particular historical cycle. That is to say, retreating from the horrible aspects of Jim Crow, or the horrible aspects of Jim Crow transforming. That is to say, you made reference to the police killing in Grand Rapids, Michigan, captured on tape, which many of us are paying attention to. It was a worker, by the way.
Correct.
That is a transformation from the days of the lynch mobs. That is to say, when private citizens of European descent would alight upon a Black person. Now it's the police, although you still have occasions when private citizens as well act similarly. So part of what's missing in terms of our struggle today is that many of our organizations and intellectuals, that is to say, people who are supposed to think for a living, are not sufficiently internationally minded. Here you have, as I suggested a moment or two ago, this conflict in Eastern Europe, which is in the process of transforming the world in which we live. But if you haven't been following international affairs or aware of the import or impact of Russia on international affairs, for example. I mean, for example, in my book on Northeast Africa, one of the points I'm going to make is that in the 1890s, one of the questions of African history is how and why did Ethiopia manage to stay independent for so long when other African nations were being colonized? And of course, if people don't have an understanding, they come to the pessimistic conclusion, as I guess one of your interlocutors was suggesting, that maybe there's something wrong with Black people. That's the answer. But if they had a better understanding of history and tried to understand Ethiopia, they would recall that in the 1890s, the Italians were trying to invade Ethiopia, as they did in the 1930s, which of course gives rise to the indigenous Jamaican religion known as Rastafarianism. But in the 1890s, the Italians were doing the same thing. The reason they were defeated was that the Ethiopians, or the Abyssinians as they were called, were armed to the teeth by Russia. And see, people, for various reasons, I understand it, because people are angry, understandably, with white supremacy. And so therefore, sometimes they don't want to study Europe because they see that as the source of evil. But if you have a worldview and understand European history, in addition to understanding African history, if you don't understand European history, you really can't understand African history, to be frank with you. If you understood European history, you would look at the map and see that most of Europe is Russian territory. Today, Russia is the most populous nation on the European continent. It has most of the natural resources in Europe, as the headlines continue to inform us: natural gas, petroleum, gold, palladium, titanium, all necessary, the latter two for the green economy and aircraft. And so there's been a historic wish by the Western Europeans, who got fat on the plunder of Africa and the Americas, to bring Russia to heel. That's what led to Napoleon's invasion after he was defeated by our brothers and sisters in Haiti. He invaded Russia, got his hat handed to him, was defeated roundly. A few decades later, you saw Britain, France, and Turkey gang up on Russia. And then in another turning point of history, if people were to try to understand history, in 1904, London finances Japan's attack on Russia. Japan prevails, which is seen by W.E.B. Du Bois and Ho Chi Minh of Vietnam and Sun Yat-sen of China and Nehru of India as a turning point in the global struggle against white supremacy. In other words, they were trying to understand European history. And then, by the way, that leads as well to the Russian Revolution of 1917, where then Moscow continues its effort to keep its Western European antagonists off balance by attacking them at the source of their wealth, which of course is colonialism, which of course leads, as you know, and if you don't know, or your listeners don't know, you can look at my book, White Supremacy Confronted, on the liberation struggle of Southern Africa, culminating in Nelson Mandela's victory at the polls in 1994, where the Southern Africans were armed to the teeth, a la the Ethiopians, Abyssinians in the 1890s, by Moscow, of course, assisted by their Cuban allies, their socialist Cuban allies. So this is the story. Now, if people don't want to understand that story, I understand, because if you get involved in the struggle, as history shows, you run the risk of getting killed or imprisoned. But if you're really sincerely interested in trying to figure out what's going on, the facts are all there. Now, if you don't want to try to understand the facts, well, you know, I understand.
I just want to say this, and I'll let you go with your comment. I'm from South Carolina, and I'm the Gullah Geechee people of South Carolina. That Gullah is a corrupt name for Angola. A lot of the slaves in South Carolina actually came from Angola. But what the thing I was trying to point out is that we have such connections to Africa. If we really understood that bloodline, it seems to me that we could do schools together. There should be a lot of projects that we could work together. You were talking about Ghana, and we had tremendous relationship from Nkrumah. There was a real love affair going on with Ghana's independence, and people like Dr. John Henry Clark and just so many of our leaders. And then when you talk about South Africa, and Nelson Mandela, there was African Americans were in the trenches and demonstrating, and they played a role in the freedom of Mandela. They was working together. I just don't can't quite understand why we can't come together, because I think we're going to have to come together as Africans and African Americans, because the bloodline is the same. I mean, we may be from different nations in Africa, but we got so much going on, and Africa is still the richest continent on the planet. So in your final remarks, can you kind of sum up what that relationship, if we can build it, and maybe how do we go about building, could do?
With regard to Angola, as suggested, I talk about that in my book, White Supremacy Confronted, and how they came to independence in 1975. With regard to Ghana, which comes to independence in 1957, I talk about Kwame Nkrumah in a number of books, including my biography of the wife of W.E.B. Du Bois, entitled Race Woman, The Lives of Shirley Graham Du Bois. With regard to coming together, well, I think that you do see Africans on the continent and the Caribbean coming together. There was a summit, virtual summit, between the African Union, incorporating 4 plus African nations, and the Caribbean community, or CARICOM, just a few months ago. They're coming up with a common agenda that involves everything from satellite connections to airline connections. The African Continental Free Trade Association is coming together, trying to form a common market, not unlike the European Union common market, which removes tariff barriers and allows free movement of goods and labor on the African continent, a historic dream, you may recall, of Kwame Nkrumah, amongst others. So there is a coming together. Now, Black Americans oftentimes are absent from this for a number of reasons. One is that unlike Jamaicans or Grenadians or Barbadians or South Africans and Zimbabweans, we don't have sovereignty. We are living under the settler regime headquartered in Washington, D.C. And I think that's one of the reasons why, for example, you saw that in the votes of the United Nations on Russia, Ukraine, the African nations, particularly the conscious ones, either voted against the United States or abstained and didn't vote at all. Whereas it's hard to find any Black American who would be echoing that African position. And in fact, even in the sites where we've accumulated wealth and power, such as the music industry, you might have seen at the Grammys, this award ceremony where people give each other honors for the record of the year, album of the year, etc. You have President Zelensky of Ukraine speaking. Interestingly enough, I don't recall any Haitians speaking to the Grammys, despite the fact that you have all these Black American millionaires, multimillionaires, perhaps even billionaires in that industry. You had John Legend singing a song in honor of the Ukrainian struggle. And once again, I think that happens because people are in league with the settler regime. In other words, we use this term African American, and that means that you may be African, but you're also carrying the passport of the United States of America. And that's the regime that, if you do not bend the knee, will put you in jail or kill you. And so, with regard to how we share the same bloodline, well, that's true. But the question is, do we share the same politics? Which is another story altogether. And it'll be difficult to share the same politics as long as people, to come full circle, don't have a fuller understanding of history, which means they're not aware of what happened yesterday, which means they'll be unaware of what may come tomorrow. And they just sort of go with the flow. And of course, going with the flow today means going with the flow of this ship of fools in which we now find ourselves on board with, which is headed towards an iceberg with catastrophe ensuing, I'm afraid to say, for the passengers on board, including ourselves.
Yes. Dr. Horne, I want to thank you. I look forward to our next session. And I want to say to all our viewers, thanks for tuning in. And don't forget to hit the join button and stay with us. Peace. Thank you.